Marquez Jerez, 2020. The engine screamed in 40-degree heat, and Marquez was in that familiar trance, hunting down the impossible. He had already saved one near crash in a way that looked superhuman. Elbow down, dirt spraying, bike half sideways, and somehow still upright. Commentators called it another Marquez miracle, but that miracle carried a curse. 5 laps from the finish, while chasing down Maverick Vinales, the rear of his Honda stepped out violently. The bike bucked him high into the air. For a split second, he was weightless. Then, gravity dragged him back like vengeance. His right arm hit first. The impact was so brutal, the humerus bone shattered cleanly, a spiral fracture that tore through muscle and nerves. He lay in the gravel, eyes wide open but silent. Marshals sprinted over, medics shouting his name, dust and heat choking the air. The camera zoomed in just enough to show the arm, limp, twisted, unnaturally still. It wasn't a dislocation, it was destruction. Within hours, he was flown to Barcelona. Surgeons inserted a titanium plate and 7 screws. They said recovery would take months. But Marquez wasn't built like most men. Just 8 days later, he appeared again at the same circuit, walking through the paddock with a half smile that looked almost delusional. The stitches hadn't even dissolved. He told the team he'd race. When he twisted the throttle during qualifying, it was clear the arm wasn't ready. The pain too sharp, the movement unstable. Days later, after overstraining it at home, the metal plate fractured, undoing the first surgery. The muscle collapsed. His arm was destroyed all over again. Second surgery, then infection, then nerve damage that refused to heal. For months, he couldn't even open a door without pain. He'd look at the bike sitting in his living room and say it felt like a ghost watching him. Honda doctors tried every therapy, stem cell treatment, bone grafts, experimental braces. Each time, the recovery stretched further. He missed the entire 2020 season, then most of 2021, then parts of 2022. Every comeback brought a new setback: double vision, shoulder weakness, dizziness. The physical pain was obvious, but the emotional pain was worse. For the first time since his rookie year, Marquez had to accept limits. The man who once defied physics now fought biology. He called it learning to be patient, but patience was never his talent. When he finally returned full-time, the scars were visible. A long, pale line down his right bicep, a constant reminder that bones can heal, but nerves remember. Every time he lifts the trophy now, that arm trembles slightly. It's not weakness, it's proof. Proof that pain doesn't always end a career. Sometimes it becomes the backbone of it. Mick Doohan, 1992. Mick Doohan was untouchable that year. 5 wins in 6 races. The Honda NSR 500 under him was pure violence. Brutal power, minimal electronics, a bike that punished mistakes. But Doohan rode it like he owned physics. Until qualifying day. The track was slick from light rain. Doohan came through Ramshoot Corner, the rear stepped out, and the bike catapulted him into the barrier at over 200 kilometers per hour. The right leg twisted under the machine and slammed the guardrail. The sound it made was sickening. Metal against bone. When he stopped sliding, the leg was bent at an impossible angle. Blood pooled into his leathers. The tibia and fibula were both broken. Arteries were severed. Marshals had to cut through his boot to relieve pressure before medics could even move him. At the hospital in Assen, doctors gave him a choice: amputation or risk losing his life to infection. Doohan refused. He called Dr. Claudio Costa, MotoGP's maverick medical genius, and demanded they find another way. Costa's team performed something unheard of, sewing Doohan's legs together, connecting the arteries of the healthy leg to the damaged one to keep blood flowing. The procedure saved the limb, but left it mangled. Weeks passed. He couldn't walk. Muscles atrophied. Painkillers barely dulled the ache. Still, with the championship slipping away, Doohan insisted on returning. He showed up at the next rounds on crutches, leg wrapped in metal braces, using special thumb controls because he couldn't shift properly. Reporters called it madness. He called it duty. Every lap looked torturous. Body rigid, right leg trembling, yet somehow finishing races. He lost the title by only 4 points to Wayne Rainey. 4 points after nearly losing a leg. Even years later, Doohan admitted he never regained full movement. The ankle joint was stiff forever. He had to modify his boots, shift gears differently, and relearn body balance. And still, from 1994 to 1998, he won 5 consecutive world championships. The leg that doctors once wanted to cut off carried him to every single one of them. Pain became his constant passenger, throbbing through every straight, tightening through every braking zone. But it sharpened him. He learned to ride around agony, to channel it into focus. When people asked him years later what he remembered most about his career, he didn't mention trophies or victories. He said quietly, "That smell smell of hospital disinfectant. It never leaves you. Doohan's survival was more than medical luck. It was human defiance. The day he refused to let them take his leg, he redefined what toughness meant in MotoGP. And every champion after him, from Rossi to Marquez, grew up knowing that the legend with the limp had already proved what the body can endure when the soul refuses to quit. Valentino Rossi Mugello Circuit, June 5, 2010. The Tuscan hills were drenched in yellow. Rossi's color, his kingdom. Every flag, every cap, every banner carried his number 46. It was the practice session before his home Grand Prix, and he looked untouchable, reigning world champion, adored by the crowd, chasing a 6th MotoGP title. Then, with no warning, it happened. Coming into the terrifyingly fast Arrabbiata 2 corner, Rossi leaned in at full commitment. The Yamaha YZR M1 suddenly snapped. The rear stepped out, the front tucked, and in a blink, the doctor was catapulted high into the air. His right leg folded under him as he hit the ground. The scream that followed froze an entire nation. Marshals reached him, but the moment they saw the leg, they looked away. The tibia and fibula were both broken, one bone piercing through the leathers, his knee twisted in the wrong direction. Rossi, usually calm, was crying, yelling in Italian for help. The cameras turned away. Even commentators couldn't speak. He was airlifted to Florence. Surgeons worked for hours, inserting titanium pins and plates into his shin. The prognosis: at least 6 months before he could walk properly. Maybe never the same again. For weeks, he disappeared. No interviews, no photos, just silence. For a sport built on noise, silence felt wrong. But behind closed doors, Rossi was fighting like a man possessed. The pain was constant. Electric shocks shooting up the leg every time he tried to move. Physiotherapy sessions turned into endurance tests. He joked through tears, "I can ride 300 kilometers per hour, but not climb stairs." 6 weeks later, the impossible happened. At Sachsenring, Germany, a man on crutches walked into the paddock wearing a yellow suit. The crowd erupted. Rossi returned not because he was fully healed, but because he couldn't stay away. He qualified 4th. In the race, he finished 4th again, with screws still in his leg. When he removed the boot after the race, the wound had reopened. Blood had soaked into the liner. He laughed and said, "It's not so bad." That broken leg changed MotoGP's idea of bravery. It showed that pain was never stronger than purpose. Rossi didn't win the 2010 title. Lorenzo did. But the image of Valentino limping to his bike became one of the most iconic sights in the sport's history. For once, the doctor needed healing, and he performed it on himself. Wayne Rainey Misano, 1993. Wayne Rainey was chasing his 4th consecutive world championship. Calm, disciplined, calculating. He was the opposite of chaos. Riding the Marlboro Yamaha, he had already built a dynasty. But fate doesn't care about discipline. During the Sunday race, on lap 12, Rainey was leading. Perfect lines, perfect control. He entered a fast left-hander, and, for once, the rear slid a fraction too far. The bike snapped sideways and high-sided with brutal force. He hit the gravel headfirst, chest forward, and tumbled violently. When he stopped moving, he tried to stand, but nothing happened. He couldn't feel his legs. The silence that followed was unlike any MotoGP crash before. Riders who passed the scene slowed down instinctively. Mechanics in the pits turned pale. Rainey was conscious, asking medics to move his legs, not realizing they couldn't. The impact had crushed his 6th thoracic vertebra, severing his spinal cord. Paralysis from the chest down. The reigning world champion's career ended in a single second. Helicopter blades spun above the circuit, and commentators whispered instead of speaking. They knew they'd just witnessed something that would scar the sport forever. In the hospital, doctors confirmed what everyone feared. Wayne Rainey would never walk again. The man who'd controlled 500cc beast with surgical precision now faced life in a wheelchair. But what he did next became legend. Within months, he started rehab, not for a comeback on the bike, but for life itself. He refused to disappear. He became a mentor, a team owner, and later one of Moto America's strongest leaders. His presence in the paddock reminded everyone that MotoGP isn't only about winning, it's about surviving with dignity. Decades later, at Goodwood Festival of Speed, Rainey rode again, the same Yamaha, modified with hand controls. Watching him roll down the hill, wind in his face, crowd on their feet, was the closest thing MotoGP has ever had to a collective prayer. Some riders measure greatness in championships. Rainey measured his in courage. He lost his legs, but never his spirit. And in doing so, he became bigger than the sport itself. Alex Rins Mugello, 2023. The sprint race had just begun when Alex Rins, riding for LCR Honda, approached Arrabbiata 1 at over 200 kilometers per hour. The bike twitched, the front folded, and in a flash of carbon and gravel, his body slammed into the trackside trackside barriers. The crash didn't look fatal at first, but then the replays stopped. Rins lay motionless, his right leg bent inward, boot torn open. Marshals surrounded him as the red flag waved. At the hospital, scans confirmed the nightmare. Compound fractures of both the tibia and fibula, multiple bone splinters, torn ligaments. Doctors inserted plates, rods, and screws. More metal than bone. The leg was barely intact. Recovery became a horror film in slow motion. Each surgery brought new complications, infections, swelling. The nerve pain so severe he couldn't sleep. At one point, he told his physio, "I can feel electricity running inside the leg." 6 surgeries later, he still couldn't walk without crutches. But what made Rins' story powerful wasn't the injury. It was the comeback. He refused to quit. While most assumed his career was over, he focused on one goal: return before season's end. He spent hours every day in water therapy, relearning how to put weight on the foot. When he finally posted a video of himself limping through the paddock, fans flooded the comments with disbelief. At the final rounds of the season, he rode again. Every corner was torture. The painkillers barely dulled the throbbing. Yet he finished the race, not for points, not for fame, but for closure. In 2024, he switched to Yamaha. That same damaged leg now rests on the foot peg of a blue M1, carrying him back into the top 10. The scar still aches in cold weather, but Rins calls it my reminder. He's not the loudest rider, not the flashiest, but he might be one of the toughest, because every time he accelerates out of a turn, it's on a limb that once barely held together. For Alex Rins, pain didn't end his career. It simply became part of his riding style. Calculated, quiet, and unbreakable. Shinya Nakano Mugello, 2004, a Kawasaki hurtling down the front straight at over 300 kilometers per hour. Green, loud, and lightning fast. Shinya Nakano was riding the lap of his life, tucked in tight, chasing tenths against the most powerful machines on the planet. The speed trap read just over 300 kilometers per hour. And then, in less than a heartbeat, the world exploded. The rear Bridgestone tire failed without warning. In a split second, the back of the bike tore itself apart, rubber flying as the Kawasaki snapped sideways at full throttle. The Kawasaki ZX-RR snapped sideways and launched Nakano into the air like a ragdoll. He hit the tarmac at terrifying speed, around 300 kilometers per hour. The bike disintegrated and slid down the straight in a shower of sparks. The entire main grandstand gasped. Commentators fell silent mid-sentence. When a MotoGP machine catches fire at top speed, you don't expect survival. You expect tragedy. Marshals ran into the inferno as Nakano tumbled through gravel, body limp, smoke and debris swirling around him. For a moment, nobody moved. It looked like the worst-case scenario. Then, through the smoke, he started moving. Nakano was alive, burned, bruised, and barely conscious, but alive. Medics found him face down, leather scorched, helmet scraped to bare carbon. The rear tire explosion had sent massive shockwaves through his lower spine and ribs. He was stretchered off as Kawasaki mechanics stood frozen, disbelief painted on every face. At the Circuit Medical Center, doctors treated bruising and contusions, mostly to his back and shoulder, incredibly light injuries for such a violent crash. He'd been seconds away from being engulfed in fire. The remains of the tire told the story, a structural failure likely caused by extreme load and heat from the Mugello Strait's relentless speed. It wasn't rider error. It was pure mechanical betrayal. Nakano's injuries were severe enough that most assumed his season was finished. But less than a week later, at the next race in Catalunya, he was back, still bandaged, ribs taped, visibly stiff. He climbed back onto a new Kawasaki. The same color, the same straight, the same risk. Reporters asked if he was afraid. He smiled weakly and said, when asked if he was afraid, he simply said he couldn't afford to think about it. He just had to ride. That fireball at Mugello became one of MotoGP's most replayed clips, not because of the violence, but because of the miracle that followed. A man went through hell at 300 kilometers per hour and refused to stay there. Nakano didn't win a world title, but that day, he did something rarer. He walked away from a crash few believed anyone could survive, and then he came back for more. Tetsuya Harada, Argentina, 1998. The final round of the 250cc World World Championship. Tetsuya Harada, Japan's quiet genius, led the race. Smooth, precise, riding like a surgeon, one hand already reaching for the world title. Behind him, his Aprilia teammate, Loris Capirossi, needed to win to steal the championship. Final lap, final corner. Harada had it in the bag. Then, out of nowhere, Capirossi dived inside. A move from an impossible angle, far too late to make the corner. His front wheel rammed straight into Harada's side. The impact was violent. Both bikes went down in a spray of dust and disbelief. Harada's body hit the gravel shoulder first. He screamed before even stopping. He hit the gravel shoulder first, suffering painful bruising and a sprained wrist, enough to end the race instantly and leave him clutching his arm in agony. Capirossi remounted and crossed the line, winning the title in the most controversial finish the 250cc class had ever seen. Harada lay in the gravel, clutching his ruined arm, his dream gone, betrayed by the man in the same team, same colors, same pit. Doctors in Valencia confirmed multiple fractures in his shoulder blade and radius. The nerves had been damaged. Movement in 2 fingers was lost for months. But what truly broke wasn't the bone. It was trust. In interviews, Harada's calm voice trembled as he said, "He took everything from me. The race, the title, the respect. He never returned to the same form again. The physical scars healed, but the emotional ones never did. His final years in racing were quiet. No revenge, no anger, just silence. That crash became folklore in Japan, a story parents told young racers as a warning that MotoGP isn't just pain from crashes, it's pain from betrayal too. Because sometimes the deepest wound isn't made by asphalt, it's made by another man's desperation." Dani Pedrosa. There are riders who measure success by championships. And then there's Dani Pedrosa, the man whose career became a collection of broken bones and silent comebacks. For over a decade, he was the smallest man on the biggest bike, 5 feet 2, 51 kilos, riding the most powerful machines on Earth. His body was never built for the brutality of MotoGP, but his spirit refused to accept that. 2003, broken ankle. 2005, fractured arm. 2006, broken collarbone. 2008, fractured wrist. 2010, broken collarbone again. 2011, another collarbone, shattered into 5 pieces after a collision with Simoncelli. Each year, surgery. Each time, return. Every x-ray looked like a map of reconstruction. Metal pins, screws, and plates scattered like constellations across his skeleton. In 2011, after the Le Mans crash, doctors inserted a titanium plate along his collarbone. The next race he missed, but when he returned at Sachsenring, he won. Still stitched, still in pain, arm taped for stability, he won. He'd often joked that airports made his life harder because of all the metal inside him. But behind the humor was exhaustion. His hands would go numb mid-race. His wrists ached after every braking zone. Yet he kept showing up, kept fighting factory riders twice his size, kept putting that Repsol Honda on podiums. He never won the Premier Class Championship. Fate always robbed him at the last step. But fans knew what he was made of. When he announced retirement in 2018, the entire paddock lined up to clap him into the sunset. Even Marquez, his once fierce teammate, said, "If anyone deserves a title, it's Dani." Then came the epilogue. 2021. KTM invited him for a wildcard race at Spielberg. 3 years out of competition, now 35 years old. Most thought it was just a symbolic gesture. Then he went out and finished in the top 10 against the new generation. His body, filled with titanium, still faster than half the grid. That wasn't nostalgia. That was proof. Proof that real strength doesn't shout. It endures quietly, lap after lap, scar after scar. Dani Pedrosa never became world champion on paper. But ask anyone in MotoGP who defines resilience, and they'll tell you it's the man who spent 15 years rebuilding himself and never once complained. Pain, it's what connects every name on this list. Bones heal, scars fade, but these men carried something deeper. Proof that MotoGP isn't about who's the fastest on a good day, but who refuses to quit on the worst one.